What if I told you that not all pain is punishment, and that according to the Bible, God sometimes allows suffering to reveal a greater purpose? That idea challenges everything you've learned about easy faith and instant prayer. Because while many present a version of religion where blessing means comfort, Job shows us the opposite. God can use the desert to build something in you that abundance never could. It's shocking, but it's true. God's silence also teaches. And maybe what you're going through right now is part of something deeper than it seems. The truth is, there are moments when you pray, fast, read the Bible, and still everything seems to fall apart. And the question that cuts deep in the heart is God still with me? If you've ever felt that, this video is for you. Today, we're going to walk through the pages of the book of Job and discover why the kind of faith that truly transforms is not the kind that avoids pain, but the kind that survives it. You'll understand how prayer can continue even when there are no answers, and how God still acts even when He seems absent. Get ready to see your spirituality with new eyes, because by the end of this video, you won't just know the story of a righteous man who suffered. You'll understand why the pain you're experiencing may be exactly what awakens the strongest, most sensitive, and most spiritual version of yourself. You'll discover that faith isn't the absence of pain, it's endurance. That God doesn't always respond the way we expect, but He always acts with wisdom. And that in the Bible, suffering isn't the end. Sometimes it's the beginning of a revelation. The book of Job is more than a story about pain. It is a piece of spiritual engineering. The Bible begins by describing a man who is upright, faithful, God-fearing, and surrounded by blessings. But that peace is interrupted by a tense dialogue between God and Satan, where Job's faith is put to the test. Religion, in this case, doesn't shield him from suffering. It faces it head-on, as if to say, let's see if your prayer can survive the wilderness. It's the beginning of a journey where pain doesn't destroy faith. It reveals what's behind it. The structure of the book unfolds in 5 major sections: a prologue in prose, poetic dialogues, a wisdom interlude, Elihu's speeches, and God's response. In the dialogues, Job's friends try to justify pain with theological arguments based on a retributive form of religion. Only the guilty suffer. Job resists praise, protests, but never abandons God. The Bible gives voice to this deep lament, showing us that true faith also questions. Suffering becomes a stage where appearances and spiritual essence collide. In chapter 28, the narrative shifts tone, ushering in the poem of wisdom, one of the most poetic moments in the Bible. Here, there is no debate, only contemplation. True wisdom is to fear God. Amid the chaos, faith gains a new layer, the kind that prays not to understand, but to trust. Religion doesn't appear as doctrine, but as reverence. And this silence in the middle of suffering teaches us that sometimes the strongest prayer is the one without words. Elihu enters the story as an unexpected character, young and provocative, and tries to offer a new explanation for pain. He claims that God also corrects out of love, and that divine discipline can be a disguised blessing. Though arrogant at times, Elihu sets the stage for the most anticipated moment. God's voice. Faith, which once fought for logic, now begins to be trained to listen. Religion shifts from human discourse to divine whisper that is about to come. When God finally speaks, He doesn't respond the way we expect. He questions Job about creation, the seas, the skies, the animals, revealing that there is a universe beyond our comprehension. The Bible closes the cycle not by explaining everything, but by revealing that God remains in control. Faith is no longer built on what we understand, but on who we know. Job's prayer changes. Now it's a surrendered offering, not an anxious demand. And his story points to something greater than restoration, a deeper understanding of pain. The central question that echoes throughout the book of Job is one of humanity's oldest. Why do good people suffer? The Bible leads us into this reflection with honesty and depth. Religion has often tried to answer this question with simplistic formulas. If you're suffering, it's because you sinned. But Job breaks this pattern. Even though he is upright, he is immersed in pain, not as punishment, but to show that faith doesn't depend on rewards, but on genuine trust in God. Job's friends represent that side of religion that tries to control divine mystery with human rules. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar are not evil. They're just trapped in a narrow logic. To them, suffering is always a sign of guilt, and prayer only has value when paired with confession. But the Bible challenges them with a greater truth. Not all pain comes from wrongdoing, and not all faith is measured by visible blessings. Sometimes, God allows the battle to reveal a glory we don't yet understand. Job becomes a symbol of a rare kind of faith, the kind that holds on even when God feels absent. He questions, cries out, laments, but never stops seeking. And that teaches us something powerful. True prayer isn't always calm. Sometimes it's filled with tears, rage, and silence. Job's religion isn't polished, it's real. And the Bible shows us that God prefers an imperfect but honest faith over a fake devotion that recites lifeless formulas. Theodicy, a heavy word for the dilemma of suffering and divine justice, finds in Job a bold answer. Maybe pain isn't meant to be explained, but to be endured with faith. God doesn't ask us to understand everything, but to trust even in the dark. The book proposes a spirituality that matures not with easy answers, but with the strength to remain standing while trembling. In those moments, prayer becomes a bridge between what we feel and what we still hope for. And religion starts to taste like intimacy instead of obligation. From this perspective, suffering is no longer just pain. It becomes transformation. God isn't punishing, He's refining. And when we look at pain through spiritual eyes, we start to see that even the desert has purpose. The Bible prepares us for this, not with empty promises, but with stories like Job's. And perhaps as we learn more about who he was, we begin to recognize ourselves in his doubts and in his courage. Job is a figure the Bible describes with rare intensity, a man of integrity, upright, who feared God and shunned evil. He's not just another character. He's a reflection of what many hope to be when they think of mature faith. But what's most impressive isn't his righteousness. It's how he remains faithful after losing absolutely everything. In his life, prayer wasn't a religious routine, it was a real connection with God. And when his faith was tested, it didn't run. It stayed burning, even in the ashes. He loses his wealth, his children, his health, and still declares, "The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." That statement isn't passive acceptance, it's absolute trust. Job's religion isn't shaped by favorable circumstances, but by a deep awareness of who God is, even when everything collapses. His heart was anchored in something that didn't depend on visible blessings. And it's here that his faith begins to teach more than any sermon. What do you do with God when everything else disappears? What stands out most in Job is his honesty. He doesn't stay silent in pain. He prays, but his prayers aren't always gentle. Sometimes they're shouts, other times groans. He doesn't pretend to be fine to seem spiritual. And that's what makes his faith so authentic. Job shows up before God exactly as he is. No masks, no performance. The Bible teaches us, through him, that true religion doesn't suppress sincere questions. God isn't offended by our pain. He walks with us inside of it. Even accused by his friends, Job holds to his truth, even without understanding any of it. And it's in that space of uncertainty that faith shines the brightest. He had no promise of restoration, no angel declaring that everything would end well. He had only his conscience before God. His faith wasn't triumphant, it was resilient. And that's the kind of faith that inspires us, because it shows that even the righteous cry, but they keep believing. Prayer doesn't need to be pretty, it needs to be real. Job becomes the image of integrity in chaos, a human being who doesn't betray his essence even when everything is stripped away. The religion he lives isn't found in rituals, but in the courage to keep talking to God while wounded. And that's why his story confronts us so deeply, because in the end, it asks, how do you respond when your faith is pushed to the edge? But that isn't the only voice that echoes in this book. When God finally speaks in the book of Job, he doesn't offer explanations. He flips the script with questions. The Bible presents a God who doesn't justify himself, but reveals the vastness beyond human logic. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? That's how it begins. And with that, religion takes on a new meaning, not to search for answers, but to learn to marvel. At this point, prayer is no longer a plea. It becomes surrender before divine greatness. God references wild animals, forces of nature, stars, the sea, Leviathan, creatures that defy reason. He isn't humiliating Job, but expanding his vision. Faith now has to mature, not based on exchanges, but on reverence. Childlike religion seeks control, mature spirituality embraces mystery, and what seemed like divine silence was actually a waiting space until Job's heart was finally ready to listen deeply. These chapters show that God's wisdom is above any theology built with human bricks. The Bible reveals that there's order even in chaos, though we might not understand it. Job, who once demanded explanations, is now invited to simply contemplate, and here lies the beauty of walking with God. Even without answers, his presence changes everything. Prayer becomes awe, faith becomes reverence, and religion becomes direct experience with the Creator. This shift changes Job's position in the spiritual landscape. He stops being the man who suffers and becomes the man who sees. And that vision doesn't come from dogma, but from encountering the infinite. The kind of religion that survives suffering is the one that opens itself to the unknown without losing hope. Job doesn't understand all the whys, but he begins to know the God behind them. And when that happens, something within him is transformed, without promises, without certainty. But before the story ends, there's one decisive act still to come. God has confronted him with wisdom and greatness, but now Job must take a step that will mark the turning point of his journey. Faith brought him this far, but humility will be what takes him across the line. And it's in this scene, between dust and revelation, that the final outcome begins to unfold. At the end of the book of Job, the Bible offers us a conclusion that's both surprising and moving. Job doesn't just survive suffering, he emerges transformed, not because he received his wealth or health back, but because he came to see God with his own eyes. He says, "Before I had only heard of you, but now my eyes see you." This is faith that passed through fire and emerged without ashes, only reverence and clarity burning in his gaze. Restoration doesn't come as a reward for performance, but as the fruit of repentance and lucidity. Job admits he spoke of things he didn't understand, and now his prayer is quieter, deeper. He doesn't demand anything from God, doesn't ask for explanations. He simply bows down. And in that posture, religion finds its purest form, humility before majesty. The faith that once wrestled for logic now rests in the recognition of divine greatness. The Bible says that God not only restores Job, but honors him publicly by rebuking his friends. Those who once accused him must now ask for the prayer of the one they wounded with premature judgment. And Job prays, He intercedes for the very people who misunderstood him. That action reveals the spiritual maturity suffering had worked in him. Religion, which once was his defense, now becomes compassion, and the faith that had been tested now becomes a bridge of mercy. Scripture tells us that Job receives twice as much as he had before: livestock, children, peace, and long life. But the most precious detail isn't in the numbers, it's in the spirit he carries after the pain. Job's prayer no longer seeks answers or victories, it seeks communion. And that is true victory, to look to heaven not as a courtroom, but as a home where God dwells. Religion becomes relationship, and faith becomes a resting place, not a performance. Job's restoration points to a deeper truth. Suffering doesn't erase purpose when it brings us closer to God. And this is where his story challenges us. Are we prepared for a faith that doesn't depend on what we receive? Because while Job was restored on the outside, he had already been rebuilt on the inside. And this story wasn't written just for us to admire a happy ending. Its message still echoes today. The book of Job is a masterpiece of biblical literature, written with a sophistication that transcends time. Scholars place its origin between the 6th and 4th centuries BC, a period of deep spiritual unrest for the Hebrew people. The language is rich, full of metaphors, rare words, and poetic structure that still impresses readers today. Here, the Bible doesn't just transmit doctrine, it delivers beauty, anguish, and transcendence. It is a form of religion that thinks, feels, and dares to question the divine. Literarily, Job blends prose and poetry in a strategic way, guiding readers through a philosophical and emotional journey. The prologue and epilogue in prose serve as narrative framing, while the poetic body dives into the depths of the human soul. It's a text that demands rereading, reflection, and reverent silence. The prayer that arises isn't one of petition, but of surrender. And the faith formed across its pages isn't theoretical, it's raw, lived between thorns and hope. Theologically, the book confronts retributive theology, the belief that good people always prosper while the wicked always suffer. This idea, still common in popular religion today, is dismantled by Job. With boldness and pain, the Bible presents a God who permits suffering without abandoning those who endure it, and that changes everything. Prayer is no longer a button to receive blessings, but becomes a sacred thread that connects us to God in the storm. In Job, faith becomes an act of resistance when nothing makes sense. The book of Job has also deeply influenced thinkers like Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Martin Luther, and even Jewish philosophers like Maimonides. It has been studied, debated, and reinterpreted for centuries because of its depth and complexity. When seen through this lens, religion stops being a rigid system and becomes a personal journey. And each time we read this story, something new is revealed. A nuance, a question, or even a whispered answer hidden in God's silence. This context helps us see that Job is not just a character, he is a symbol. And the book is not just sacred text, it is a spiritual map. A map to navigate suffering without losing faith, to keep praying even when the heavens seem silent. The Bible didn't place this story just to be read, it was meant to be lived. And when we look at it with spiritual eyes, we realize that it's not just theology on the line, it's how we choose to respond to the wounds of life. The story of Job, though ancient, is more relevant than ever. In a time when religion is often sold as a quick fix, the Bible offers us a spirituality that walks through the valley of the shadow of death. Job teaches that true faith doesn't eliminate suffering, it sustains us within it. His journey shows that sincere prayer doesn't always change the circumstances, but it changes who we are in the middle of them. And God keeps working even when silence seems to be his only response. How many times has pain shown up unannounced, pulling the ground out from under you and making you ask, "Where is God?" That's where Job's story becomes both balm and confrontation. Modern religion often claims that prayer guarantees total protection, but the Bible reveals something deeper. Prayer is also trusting when pain won't let go. Job received no promises before he suffered, but he gained revelations afterward. And that pattern still repeats today for those who hold on, even when everything falls apart. To apply Job today is to accept that faith must mature in order to face divine silences. Not every no from God is rejection, and not every desert is absence. Often it's preparation. Job didn't have a lively worship service to help him stand up again, nor did he receive immediate heavenly answers, but he endured. And that shows us that even on the days when we feel nothing, prayer still builds a bridge. Faith that endures fire is the faith that learns to trust without explanations. Spiritually, Job invites us to stop trying to control God with sacrifices or formulas. He teaches us to come before God stripped down in honesty with tears, if necessary, but without losing connection. The kind of religion that survives suffering understands that a relationship with God is worth more than the blessings He gives. The Bible prepares us for difficult days, not for polished faith, but for a spirituality that can withstand storms without breaking from within. So when we read Job today, we must ask ourselves, am I ready for a faith that doesn't depend on guarantees? The prayer you offer today may not change everything around you, but it can completely change you, and maybe that's the greatest lesson of all. God is more interested in who you become through the process than in what you lose in it. And if Job came out of the ashes with a renewed heart, maybe you can too. But before we finish, there's still one essential thing left to complete this journey. After everything you've just heard, let me ask you, could the pain you're facing right now have a hidden purpose? Could it be that God is shaping you in silence, just like He did with Job? The Bible doesn't give us every answer, but it shows us paths, and one of them is trusting even when we don't understand. Honest prayer, the kind that flows through tears and questions, remains a powerful bridge, and the kind of faith that survives suffering is the one that blossoms when everyone else expects you to wither. So what part of this story stirred something inside you? Is there a corner of your life where you feel like Job, lost in pain, unsure why? It's happening, but trying hard to hold on to your faith? What might God be building while everything else seems to be falling apart? Think deeply about it. Share in the comments what touched your heart the most, or simply write, I choose to trust, even without understanding. Your public act of faith might awaken someone else who's suffering in silence. And if this message spoke to you, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you won't miss the daily words that will strengthen your faith. There's a new video here every day, always with content that brings you closer to God and builds your spiritual walk. Oh, and don't forget to like the video. It helps this message reach more people who, just like you, are facing hard days. God bless you, and remember, you are not alone. The pain may be loud, but God is still writing.